The shroud was not a painting, not a scorch, or not a photograph.
Well, you see this when you see the shroud in negative. Like, Jamie, pull up an image of it. It's very strange. Like, it shows the lash marks on his body. Yeah. It shows his facial features. It shows the holes where his wrist is, where he was crucified.
Barrie Schwortz. In the spring of 2026, a research team in Italy published something that reignited one of the oldest debates in science and religion: new genetic material recovered from the Shroud of Turin. Headlines called it shocking. Some called it proof. Scientific American called it something else entirely, a result that doesn't show the relic's true origins at all. To understand why a scrap of 2,000-year-old looking linen can still make global headlines in 2026, you have to go back to 1978 and to one skeptical photographer who never expected the shroud to take over the rest of his life. His name was Barrie Schwortz. And this is the real story, not the exaggerated one, of what he found, what the science actually says, and why the Shroud of Turin remains one of the most argued over objects on Earth. Barrie Schwortz was a working commercial photographer from Chicago, a graduate of the Brooks Institute of Photography, when a colleague named Don Devon called him in 1977 with an unusual request. A team of scientists was being assembled to conduct the first in-depth physical examination of the Shroud of Turin, and they needed a technical photographer who could document everything with precision. Schwartz's own account of that call, retold for decades on the platform he later built, was that he laughed, he was Jewish, and the shroud was, in his words, a Christian relic that had nothing to do with him. He took the job anyway, mostly as a professional opportunity. He assumed, like most people who'd heard of the shroud, that it was almost certainly a medieval painting, clever, old, but ultimately explainable. In October 1978, Schwartz traveled to Turin as the official documenting photographer for the Shroud of Turin research project, known as STURP. It remains the only time in modern history that a team of scientists, physicists, chemists, forensic pathologists among them, was given direct, sustained physical access to the cloth. For 5 days and nights, the team ran a battery of tests: photomicrography, infrared and ultraviolet photography, X-ray fluorescence, spectroscopy, and analysis using an image analysis device called the VP-8 image analyzer, originally built to process satellite photos of planetary surfaces. That last device produced the finding STURP is most famous for. When a normal photograph is fed into a VP-8, converting image darkness into vertical relief produces a distorted, meaningless blob because a photograph encodes light and shadow, not physical distance. When the STURP team fed in an image of the shroud, it produced a coherent, three-dimensional relief map of a human form. Ordinary photographs and paintings don't behave that way. That anomaly, sometimes called the shroud's 3D encoding, is real. It has been replicated by other researchers since, and it's one of the genuine reasons the object continues to be studied rather than dismissed outright. What STURP did not find was any evidence of pigment, paint, or dye forming the body image itself. Their photographs, including transmitted light images that show through the cloth, indicate that bloodstains, water stains, and scorch marks all soaked into the fibers, but the image of the body did not, and no binder or pigment was detected in it. That is a genuinely documented result from a real scientific team, and it's the finding most responsible for keeping the medieval forgery theory from being an open and shut case. None of this proves the shroud is 2,000 years old, and STURP never claimed that it did. What it means is that STURP could not identify how the image was formed using the technology and materials known to exist in any era, which is a real, published, and still debated open question, not evidence of the supernatural on its own. One recurring argument in shroud research involves the color of the bloodstains. Fresh blood turns dark brown as it dries and ages. The bloodstains on the shroud, visible in Schwartz's own 1978 photographs, still show a reddish tone. Some researchers who worked with STURP, notably the biochemist Alan Adler, who analyzed blood-like material from the samples, argued that this could be explained by unusually high bilirubin levels, consistent with the extreme physical trauma, repeated beating, and death by a slow, asphyxiating method that would flood a body with stress hormones and breakdown products, altering how the blood ages and appears. This is a real hypothesis that has circulated in the shroud research literature for decades. It is also genuinely contested. Critics point out that other explanations exist for a reddish tint, including the possibility of added colorant or simple differences in preservation conditions, and forensic chemists outside the small community of shroud researchers have not treated the bilirubin explanation as a settled, mainstream finding. It belongs in the category of an interesting, unresolved argument, not proof either way. In 1988, the Catholic Church authorized what many assumed would be the final word, radiocarbon dating. Samples were cut from a corner of the cloth and sent, under controlled conditions, to 3 separate laboratories, the University of Arizona, Oxford, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. Their results, published in Nature in 1989 by Damon and colleagues, were consistent across all 3 labs, a calibrated date range of 1260 to 1390 AD, with the study's authors stating this provided conclusive evidence that the linen was medieval. That result mattered enormously, and is worth being honest about it, because a documentary that only tells you about Sturt's 1978 findings and skips the carbon dating is not giving you the full picture. A date of 1260 to 1390 AD lines up almost exactly with the Shroud's first solidly documented appearance in historical record in France in the 1350s, which is itself a point critics have long raised in favor of the medieval forgery hypothesis. That said, the 1988 test has not been free of controversy in the decades since, and this part is also real, published science, not fringe speculation. Statisticians re-examining the raw laboratory data in later years, including a 2013 and 2019 reanalysis, found that the measurements from the 3 labs showed more internal inconsistency than the original 95% confidence claim accounted for, suggesting the sample tested may have been contaminated or was not representative of the whole cloth, possibly because it was cut from a corner of the shroud that had been repeatedly handled and possibly rewoven or repaired over centuries. Some researchers, including chemist Raymond Rogers, argued the actual sample used may have come from a medieval patch rather than the original weave. A 2019 paper in the Journal of Cultural Heritage went as far as saying the original data suffer from a lack of precision which seriously affects the reliability of the 1260 to 1390 range and called for a fresh test. It's important to be precise about where the actual scientific consensus sits. As one Nature editor put it in 2019, nothing published since 1988 offers compelling evidence that overturns the original medieval date. The debate about testing methodology is real and ongoing, but it has not produced a rival, broadly accepted alternative date for the cloth. Anyone telling you the carbon dating has been debunked is overstating a genuinely contested but still unresolved statistical argument. This is the part of the story that most recent headlines are chasing, and it deserves to be told accurately because the real findings are interesting enough without exaggeration. In 2015, a team led by geneticist Johnny Barcaccia at the University of Padua analyzed dust particles that had been vacuum collected from the back of the shroud in 1978 and 1988. Using DNA analysis, they identified genetic material, human, plant, fungal, and bacterial, consistent with a wide range of geographic origins, sequences linked to Europe, the Near East, the Caucasus, and notably, a genetic signature associated with the Indian subcontinent. In a decade-old finding widely reported at the time, the team suggested this pattern was compatible with people from many regions having come into physical contact with the cloth over its documented history, including during periods when it was displayed and touched by pilgrims or transported through trade routes, rather than pointing to any single, exotic point of origin. In early 2026, the same Padua-led team, working with researchers including Alessandro Achilli at the University of Pavia, went further. Using metagenomic sequencing, reading essentially all the genetic fragments recoverable from a shroud sample taken in 1978, rather than targeting specific markers, they found what one science writer accurately described as an achingly diverse array of medieval and modern DNA belonging to humans, animals, and plants. The human component alone showed genetic signatures from at least 14 different individuals of varied ancestry, with the team estimating roughly 55% tracing to lineages common in the Near East, close to 39% associated with Indian genetic ancestry, and a smaller share linked to Europe. Alongside the human DNA, the researchers detected genetic traces of cats, dogs, cattle, pigs, and food plants including carrots, wheat, corn, peanuts, and bananas, the ordinary genetic residue you'd expect to accumulate on any old textile that has been touched, stored, and transported by many hands over a long period. Barcaccia and his colleagues were careful about what conclusions this supports. In their own words, reported by Live Science when the related 2015 study came out, the team's position was that individuals from different regions and ethnic backgrounds came into contact with the shroud either in Europe or in their own lands of origin, and that we cannot say anything more on its origin. The 2026 paper's own authors were even more direct, writing that the sheer diversity of the genetic material means it challenges the possibility of identifying the original DNA of a shroud at all. A scientific way of saying the DNA tells us about the cloth's long, well-traveled life, not about who was wrapped in it 2 millennia ago. Scientific American's coverage of the 2026 results made the same point bluntly. Outside researchers cautioned that this kind of contamination-heavy genetic soup cannot, and does not, establish where, or when the shroud originated, despite how the finding was covered in some outlets. So here is the honest version of the DNA mystery. Researchers did find genetic material from multiple geographically distant human populations on the shroud, and that finding is real, peer-reviewed, and published in scientific reports and other credible journals. What it is not is unexplainable, and it is not evidence that mainstream scientists are afraid to discuss. It has been openly published, openly reported by outlets ranging from Scientific American to Live Science to Vatican News, and openly debated by the same researchers who generated it. The straightforward explanation, a well-traveled, publicly displayed, repeatedly handled medieval to modern textile, accumulating genetic contamination from countless people, animals, and plants across centuries, fits the data without requiring any hidden panic in the scientific community. What happened to Schwortz personally is where this story becomes less about laboratory results and more about one man's decades-long relationship with a question he never set out to answer. After the 1978 examination, Sturp spent years analyzing the data the team had collected, eventually publishing findings in peer-reviewed venues arguing that no known artistic technique from history could account for the image. Schwortz has described staying skeptical for a long time afterward, in part because of the reddish bloodstains that didn't fit his understanding of how blood ages, the same open question described above. In 1996, Schwortz founded Shroud.com, which grew into the largest and most extensive shroud research archive on the internet, drawing visitors from more than 160 countries. In 2009, he founded the Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association, STERA, a non-profit to which he donated the website and his photographic archive, aiming to preserve the material for future researchers regardless of what they eventually concluded. He spent the following decades lecturing internationally, appearing on the History Channel, Discovery Channel, CNN, the BBC, and Vatican Radio, and co-authoring a book on the shroud's photographic evidence. Schwortz died on June 21, 2024, at the age of 77, having spent close to half a century as one of the most visible figures in shroud research, a role he entered as a skeptic doing a photography job and never fully left. It's worth being clear-eyed here. Schwortz was an advocate. Over the decades, he became convinced, on the basis of the evidence he'd worked with, that the shroud was authentic, and he said so publicly and often. That's a legitimate position for a researcher to hold after decades of study, but means his own writings and lectures represent one side of a real, unresolved scientific and historical argument, not a neutral verdict. Strip away the dramatic framing, and here is what can honestly be said. The 1978 Sturp examination is real, well-documented, and found no pigment, paint, or dye responsible for the body image itself, along with a genuine, still unexplained three-dimensional information encoded in the image's density pattern. The 1988 radiocarbon dating is also real, and it places the linen's origin in the 13th or 14th century with a methodology that has since been credibly, if not conclusively, challenged on statistical and sampling grounds, a genuine open question in the peer-reviewed literature, not a resolved one in either direction. The DNA studies from 2015 through the 2026 metagenomic analysis are real, peer-reviewed, and show exactly what you'd expect from an old, widely handled textile. A broad mix of human, animal, and plant genetic material from many geographic regions, reflecting centuries of contact rather than pointing to a single origin. And the scientists who generated that data have said so themselves on the record. None of that adds up to a cover-up, a suppressed panic, or scientists who are afraid to publish. It adds up to something both more ordinary and more genuinely interesting. A 700-year-old, at minimum, piece of linen, extraordinarily well-preserved and displaying image characteristics researchers still can't fully replicate, wrapped in a debate that's been conducted almost entirely in the open, in named journals, under real researchers' bylines for nearly 50 years. Whether that adds up to the burial cloth of a man executed in 1st century Judea, or an extraordinary and still not fully understood medieval object, remains a matter of ongoing scientific inquiry and personal belief, not a hidden truth someone is trying to keep from you. The primary sources: Damon et al. in Nature, 1989, Barcaccia et al. In Scientific Reports 2015, and the 2026 follow-up, and the STURP team's own published papers are all publicly available for anyone who wants to read past the headlines and decide for themselves.